Hi everyone, and welcome to week 4 of English 2. So at this point we are starting to look at our major elements of fiction. So we're going in a little more in depth on fiction. I had assigned a reading for that. I am unassigning it, so the reading for this week you do not have to do, because it's essentially going to duplicate a lot of what I'm going to talk about with each of these 6 elements of fiction. So it says you need to do it on the syllabus. Don't worry about that reading. We'll go back to readings and discussions next week. For this week, just watch videos and you're fine. So our 6 elements of fiction are plot, characterization, setting, point of view, voice and style, and theme. We'll look at each of these throughout. I think we'll have probably a video for each of those items over the next few weeks. Today we'll be focusing on the first of those elements, which is plot. And as we go through each of the others, we'll deal with them in more detail. So, plot is what happens in a story. That part's easy. Any of us would define that as plot, probably. But plot is not just that. A happens, and then B happens, and then C happens. That's not really plot. It's a series of things that happen. In order for a plot to be plot, it also has to talk about how those things relate to each other, how they're interrelated, how they're working with cause and effect, or in some other way working in context with each other. The early 20th century writer E.M. Forster famously kind of compared plot to not plot, as not plot is the king died and then the queen died. Okay, it's a sequence of events, but it's not really telling us much. Plot is the king died and then the queen died of grief. So that's a story. Like, we now know how these two events are connected, how the first one gives rise to the second one, and it makes us care more already. Even if we don't know the king and we don't know the queen, we still have a story there, and we're more able to get invested in it. The other big thing that a plot pretty much has to have is conflict. I noticed in the discussions of happy endings, several of you point out that story A, the one where, everything is happy and, they get married and they have, a fulfilling sex life and they, buy a nice house and property values rise and they have great kids and, they die happy. It's not really a very good story. And that's because it has no conflict. What we want in our stories, we may not want conflict and drama in our real lives. It's ideal if we can avoid as much of that as possible often. But conflict in our stories, drama in our stories, those are things we want. Without those, it's not much of a story and it's kind of boring. And specifically, when it comes to plot, there are 3 conflicts that every plot will fall into. 3 main conflicts. Those 3 conflicts, and the original terms for these use man. I'm going to use person to be more inclusive of, there being more than one gender, and also because often we'll have characters who aren't even human. So, person works well if, all of your characters are aliens. So, our 3 main conflicts are person versus nature, and person versus self. Person versus person is exactly what it sounds like. Some kind of interpersonal conflict between people. This kind of conflict does not have to be, yelling at each other or punching each other out. Just has to be some kind of difficulty, some kind of struggle, some kind of thing that does not go smoothly. So, a good example of a conflict that often doesn't involve actual fighting is romance. Most romance stories, our conflict comes from the personality clashes between our people in the romance. Often they'll, start out not liking each other, or due to the circumstances they meet, they'll, have some assumptions about each other, And as they get to know each other more, then they find that they do actually like each other. Maybe these assumptions weren't true, and their feelings of antipathy or just apathy towards this other person then becomes a certain kind of affection and love. So conflict can be any kind of struggle or difficulty or thing that's not going smoothly. It does not have to be like a knockdown, drag-out fight. So person versus person, conflict between people. And that's going to be whatever conflict your main character is having, or your protagonist. And we'll talk more about that in the next video on character. Our second conflict is going to be person versus nature. So this is going to be a person's conflict with anything that is not a person, not some kind of sentient being. So if someone's trying to survive out in the wild, if someone is trying to battle cancer, if someone is if your main character is trying to survive coronavirus, all of those are going to count as human versus nature, because those things are not people, but they are still something that's causing struggle, that's causing difficulty, and so you have conflict, just not person-created conflict, and so therefore those are going to be person versus nature. Any kind of physical illness falls under this. Obviously, any kind of survival story, any kind of natural disaster story, all of those tend to fall in that human versus nature, or person versus nature category. Our third conflict is going to be internal conflict. So the previous two were external. Person versus person, person outside of you. Person versus nature, something non-person outside of you. The final conflict is person versus self, which is person versus themselves. And this is going to involve anything where someone is struggling internally. So maybe their instincts are telling them to go one way, but their brain is telling them to go another way. Or there's some kind of conflict between what they want to do in their brain and what they want to do in their heart. Or someone knows that this is a bad thing, like this is a bad urge, like a bad habit, and they're trying to keep from giving into it. So all of those are going to be internal conflict. This includes often stories about dealing with addiction or mental illness. We tend to classify those as self in ways that we don't physical illness. That tends to be nature, just because mental illness definitely does tend to affect the way we think and like who we are as a person often. So we do consider that internal conflict. So your stories about people like going insane, that is going to be a person versus self. But also a person, trying to change who they are, or a person who's trying to deal with societal expectations that they feel like they should fulfill, and being, a good person versus doing what they feel is actually the right thing to do, and maybe not being considered a good person by other people. So all of those are going to be internal conflicts, and that between those three, that covers pretty much every kind of conflict you can have, external and internal. So all stories are going to be one of those three. Conflicts, in addition to falling under one of these headings, also tend to go in a certain pattern. The pattern gets kind of written down and kind of named by a guy called Gustav Freytag in the 19th century, a novelist from Germany, who went to a lot of plays. And as he watched these 5-act plays, because that's usually the way they were set up then, he noticed that there were certain patterns. The same kinds of stuff happened in Act 1 of all these plays. The same kind of stuff happened in Act 3 or 4 or 5. And if the events were different, they were fulfilling the same purpose. And so he came up with a 5-act structure that he said stories tend to follow. And in general, we've tended to adopt it since then, and we've named it after him. We call it Freytag's Pyramid. There is in fact an actual diagram with a pyramid that I will upload to Blackboard along with this video. But we've named it after him because he was the person who kind of codified it for us, wrote it down. So this pyramid and these conflicts tend to have the same things happen in the same order. and it's a 5-step process. First step, exposition. This is setup. This is laying the groundwork. This is background. This is setting. This is telling us what this world is, who these characters are, what their relations to each other are, what are the things that we need to know for this conflict to work. So, as an example of like Harry Potter again, let's say your main conflict is Harry versus Voldemort. In order to set up that conflict properly, you probably need to like tell us who Harry is, tell us who Voldemort is, talk about the background and why this is such a big conflict. In the case of that story, it's because Voldemort killed Harry's parents and tried to kill him, and he's not dead and he's going to come after Harry. So these are things we need to know for that conflict to kind of work, to make sense. This also includes things like introducing us to the wizarding world, introducing us to the characters. Like Hagrid in both the books and the movies is a great character for this kind of exposition because he's the one through which Harry learns about all this stuff. Our second stage, is rising action. So at some point our exposition ends and our conflict begins. Usually there's some specific event that happens that sets our conflict in motion. So you could probably look at a few different places for that in Harry Potter. You could say it starts when Harry finds out that Voldemort killed his family. You could say that it starts when they finally openly meet first at the end of the first book or movie. Depending on how you're characterizing this conflict, you can put that initiating moment, that turning point, in a different place. But at some point, our conflict has to begin. And it usually begins with a thing that happens. And then once that thing has happened, our conflict, it doesn't lessen from there. It tends to get bigger. It tends to rise as our rising action. So we have kind of tension building, we have stress building, where we're not sure what's happening, but we know that we're going somewhere. Once all that tension is built, once that conflict has kind of bloomed and blossomed, we end up with our third stage, which is the climax. This is the emotional high point of the story. This is the moment where shit happens, like shit goes down. Back in the day on network TV, there would often be episodes where they'd say in the previews, like, in this episode everything changes, and this is that moment. This is the thing where that conflict comes to a head. There's often some kind of actual confrontation between the characters or some kind of realization. This is the moment that the entire story so far has been leading to, and understandably, like, this is a big moment. It changes everything. But that's not the end of our story. Like, we can't end there. We want to know, if this changes everything, how does it change everything? If our conflict has kind of come to a head, and people have had that big argument or that fight or that big internal realization, how are they growing from that? How are they changing? How has that changed them? So our fourth stage is going to be falling action. So our climax has happened. We're winding down now because we're nearing the end. But we still need to see the after effects of that climax play out. We want to know how things have changed. What is the result of that thing that we were building towards? And this tends to be shorter in more modern stories than it was in those 5-act plays, but definitely we still have this part. And then denouement, or denouement, if you want to go with the actual French pronunciation, or conclusion, is going to be where our conflict is resolved, at least to some extent. This point, we wrap things up, at least for this story. We may still leave some loose ends if it's got a sequel coming or something, but this particular story is now wrapped up and completed. We know what happened. If it's like a mystery, this is a romance. Here's the part where like we finally see our two characters, get together and realize that it's going to be okay, and they're going to get that happily ever after, or something close to it. And in general, this is where we get our new normal. This is the exposition sets up the old normal before that conflict comes in and just shakes everything up. This is our new normal. Now, our conflict has happened, and where does it leave us? As we're going into either the end of the book and where characters will be indefinitely, or where they'll be, at the end of this book in preparation for the next book in the series, or TV episode, or TV season, or movie, etc. So, kind of going back to our Harry Potter example, that exposition is going to be that setup. Our rising action and that kind of initiating moment is going to be something relating to Harry kind of coming to terms with Voldemort, whether that's finding out about Voldemort or actually confronting him. Our climax of the series, you could probably go a couple of different places. You could put it about at that halfway point where Harry faces down Voldemort in the graveyard. He's just watched one of his friends get killed on Voldemort's order. This is the moment where kind of everything changes and the books go from kids' books to young adult books. So in a lot of ways you could argue that everything is kind of the consequences of that moment where Voldemort kills Cedric Diggory, he fights with Harry, he gets his body back using Harry, and at that point, things are worse. You could also put the climax at the big confrontation between Harry and Voldemort in the final book or the final movie, and that could also work. That is also a big emotional moment where everything changes. The question is, which one of these do you think is bigger and has more consequences? You could, I think, make a case for either of those, or possibly some moments in between. Maybe one of the moments where Harry finds out about Horcruxes or something. Something that changes that conflict kind of irrevocably, and that everything has kind of been building towards. Telling you where you see that climax happening, the falling action will be longer or shorter, but it's going to be the consequences of that climax moment. So, in the case of that first one, it's going to be all of the stuff once Voldemort comes back. Like, it's maybe not super tense because we knew shit was going to get bad, and it does. But you could also be, the moments after Harry confronts Voldemort and dies and comes back to life. So definitely there are different ways you could have that falling action get set up. And then we have our denouement or conclusion. That is going to be our ending. So in the case of Harry Potter, this is probably going to be that epilogue where it's like, 20 years later, and all of our main characters are in their 30s and they're sending their own kids off to Hogwarts, and like it kind of shows us the new normal. Like our characters are going to be okay as they go off into the future, and like at that point everything is pretty much resolved. Keep in mind that all of these things are going to happen with that main conflict that makes up the plot, but often we'll have subplots or smaller conflicts, and those will often follow this same pattern. Also, we'll sometimes have plots within plots. Think of like a TV show. Each episode will have its own plot often, even as the season has its own plot, and the show as a whole has its own plot. And each of those is kind of working in support of the larger one, even as it's working as itself. So, in general, most of our conflicts, most of our plots, whether they're big scale ones or small scale ones, they're still going to follow this same pattern. For example, with Harry Potter, there are a lot of other conflicts. Like, there's his conflict with his kind of rival Draco Malfoy. There's his conflict with his teacher, Professor Snape. There's his frequent kind of conflicts with his friends. There's conflicts with, Dumbledore at times. Conflicts with, other characters, like his godfather Sirius. There's a lot of different kinds of conflicts in the story. And just because those are not the main conflict, the main plot, doesn't mean they're not important, and it doesn't mean that they don't still usually follow this same narrative arc. So hopefully you found this helpful for thinking about stories and plots and how they work and how they're constructed. Kind of keep an eye on things you watch or read as we move forward through the semester, and you'll probably find yourself noticing, if you think about it, that stories do tend to follow this structure. And that doesn't mean that it's, bad or even necessarily predictable. It just means that, there are certain things that a story has to do to be interesting and work as a story, and that's something that most stories do. So, hopefully I found that helpful. Our final video for the week should go up tomorrow. Sorry, this one is going up so late. I had some technical issues earlier in the week. And that's going to be about character. So I will see you all then. Bye.